If US leadership and culture actually intended to integrate blacks as equals, then 200 years would have been enough time to do it. See how quickly other white races were integrated as equals. We can do it if we want to. Karl Marx made the point that lower class workers, despite being paid the least, actually produce the value, and are therefore essential to the CEO, but not the other way around. Paths out of poverty and other avenues of escaping the lower class are more useful at pacifying protests than they are at the stated goal of helping anybody succeed. Even though you can go to college and escape poverty, your parents, friends, and other loved ones remain impoverished. And by accepting your role in a gentrified corporation, you have not escaped Egypt, you have merely become Egyptian. Sending support back home is not only admirable and very empathetic, it also convinces more and more culturally black women to teach their kids to be culturally white. So as much as individuals succeed by leaving and gentrifying, their culture of origin, their tribe, is weaker because it has lost a genuine member. Even if they send money back home, it adds up to equal to selling a child or tribesman away for profit, or selling them into slavery in exchange for money for the rest of your life. The white Egypt does not force you to sell your children, but it does teach children that they should want to be sold, meaning gentrification and leaving the physical location of the tribe in exchange for more money. Our modern Egypt worships the god of paper. When you prosper and have food and fun, it can only be acceptable if it is agreeable to the paperwork. It is according to the paperwork that black people are equal and not oppressed. And if objections arise because of the physical reality of oppression, other paperwork is used to justify it and once again convince the black individual to gentrify in order to survive. If you do not incorporate and play the paper game, you will either become homeless or incarcerated. One sign that our white rulers are pathologically different than you, my black neighbor, is a deeply ingrained, biologically supported selfishness. This has multiple expressions, but one telltale sign is misophonia. Misophonia is when the sound of another person eating annoys you. A human being designed by nature to be tribal or communal, otherwise known as empathetic and warm-blooded mammal, should not be deterred or put off by any activity of success in the tribe. It is the cold climates and harsh environments of low resources, scarcity, where the selfish and the turncoat, the traitor, and the psychopath adapted by necessity. This is an obvious yet unexplored biological basis for the idea of white supremacy. It is an expression of cultural and probably genetic selfishness. Your white neighbor is so selfish all throughout his DNA that even just knowing his own child is eating, the sound of it raises anger and annoyance. Whites invent excuses that agree with the paperwork. Oh, this isn't dinner time. You're going to ruin your appetite. That's not the right food. But again, the physical reality was a selfish desire to save and conserve resources by preventing a competitor from eating your food, even if that competitor is your child. A human being, mother, sacrifices her own food to make sure the children eat. Whereas it is the biological position of the white, both men and women, to only find the sound of eating acceptable if they themselves are eating. the exact opposite of a warm-blooded human. The fact of this internal and inborn selfishness at the familial level should be a glaring and definitive sign that white leadership, and in fact most white motivation, is selfish. They're selfish even with their children. They do not care about you. And any action to genuinely support blacks is only as attractive as the bribe that it comes with. A white that purportedly empathizes with blacks is not in any way exceptional to these biological tendencies. A lizard will gladly live among mammals who regularly feed it. But in all honesty, my belief for the moment is that this is unwise, because a turncoat, like a chameleon, is generally focused on being the right color to blend in. It changes itself to fool enemies. A human-shaped lizard that changes appearance to blend in with genuine humans is called a mimic, or a skinwalker, and is a fearsome enemy indeed. All the more an enemy and fearsome because it will skillfully explain to you why it is not your enemy and not fearsome. Mimic, or skinwalker, is not the only urban legend that accurately corresponds to whites. Another example with a bizarrely striking resemblance to white rule is the vampire. A vampire, according to legend, is allergic to sunlight. But that's a joke compared to the other vampire rules. A vampire cannot enter a house without being invited inside. It's just one of the rules. In exactly the same way, if you invite a white to dinner, despite the fact that this invitation implies entry into their home, they will wait at the exact threshold of entry until explicitly invited inside. This is a rule of conduct amongst whites and gentrified others, as much obeyed as by classical vampires. I have on multiple occasions experimented by inviting friends over and leaving my apartment door open. I sit near the door and wait for them inside. They have been invited by text to join me for some activity, usually video games or smoking or drinking or eating. I'm inside, the activity is inside, and there is zero chance that anything has changed. I sit at an open door, I make it super obvious that I'm just waiting for them to get here. But still, white friends stop at the open door and ask to be invited in. When the times I would test them, the results were again bizarrely similar to the legend. Something that I've said. You are not invited inside, but I've been waiting for you, let's hang out. You can be very obvious about this whole experiment, and still a white person or a vampire will refuse to break this rule as though it was physically impossible. And they will excuse themselves by referring to the paperwork. The law says, etc., about property, even though the physical reality is that you have invited them by text and that would be sufficient evidence to the law that they're supposed to be there and that they're supposed to enter. The fact is that white people are frankly unaware of their condition as vampires or mimics or something like both, and are making excuses to seem normal and not be recognized as an other. This is more instinctual than it is conscious. Most of them have no idea they're like this. Please verify this experiment and realize that your enemy, your neighbor, and your rulers are genuinely a different creature than you are. The difference is not just financial or cultural or color. The difference is emotional. As much as the differing emotional patterns of dogs versus cats enforces and demonstrates their identity as unique species, the strikingly different emotional patterns of whites versus blacks should clue you in on the genuine hereditary difference between us. I find it unlikely that black humans will ever escape oppression unless they recognize their oppressors as a different species, not just a different culture. Whites and aristocracy very comfortably identify different species based on differences in color, bone shape, and behavior. You might think genetics is how they do it, but no, that comes later. They verify it. Genetics is a new practice. It was based originally on your bone shape, which is the shape of your whole body, the color that you are, and the way you act. Anyway, but whites will stubbornly refuse to examine the difference between races. Factually, blacks have denser muscles and bones, different skin, different hair. But in order to convince blacks to continue their servitude, the mimic will insist that we are the same mentally, and therefore we are both equally human. And therefore, he would never take advantage of you, despite the practical reality of him making more money than you and being your master for 8 hours a day. A mimic, keep in mind, tries to convince you of equality. We're both human, as a way to benefit from you. It's not to raise you up, but to enslave you in a way that you agree to, and then teach your kids as normal. If you really think that, for example, liberal politicians care about black people, please consider that this is a political farce, a distraction designed to provide an outlet for your emotions. It will not eventually lead to black equality or success. At most, it will change the paperwork sufficiently to satisfy the general population into getting back to work. But you are still in Egypt, a slave. If you want to be free from slavery, then you have to be free from the race that enslaves everything it can. Exactly as Moses and the ancient Hebrews fled slavery in Egypt, you, the black man, are a modern Hebrew. In a modern Egypt, and Exodus is the only path to freedom.